Good morning. Today we look at John chapter 19, verses 1 through 22. And this portion of John 19, we find Jesus in front of Pilate, and we find him going out carrying his cross to Golgotha. Hard things to read, but it begins. Pilate couldn't find any fault with Jesus. I mean, he declared him innocent, but yet he had him flogged, and that just it just seems strange. I mean, but in a way, he did it to try to pacify these people that were, wanting Jesus crucified. Well, maybe if I just have him flogged, he'll be happy, but no, that wasn't enough. They just uh, they wanted him crucified, and that was it, and they had him, the soldiers made this crown of thorns. They dressed him in a purple cloth, and they came up mocking him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And if they only knew how right they were, And the one at the foot of the cross in one of the Gospels, the centurion when Jesus dies, he does say, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." Um, but they didn't all believe. But Pilate tried his best to let Jesus go. He found no fault with him, and yet the people were stirred up against Jesus. And he said, in verse 4, Pilate went out, "I am bringing him out to you to let you know I find no case against him." Nothing. There is no reason to have him flogged, to have him crucified. I mean, there's just not any reason. So he came out, Jesus did, and Pilate said, "Here's the man." And the chief priests stirred everyone up and were shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate said, "Take him yourself and crucify him. I find no case against him." So here, Pilate is just, I can't find any reason, Pilate says. What's going on? Why can't you understand that? Pilate said, basically. And then the people say, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he claimed to be the Son of God." And when Pilate heard that, then he's worried. I mean, it says when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. He understood the gravity of the situation. He understood that, Jesus wasn't guilty, but for some reason, these Jews, these chief priests and everyone were stirred up against him. And he went back in, Pilate did, and asked Jesus again, "Where are you from?" Jesus didn't answer. Pilate said again, "Well, why aren't you going to speak to me, Do you not know that I have power to release you or power to crucify you?" Pilate, he's the high-ranking Roman official in the area. And yeah, he does have power. But Jesus' answer kind of sets him back. Jesus says, "You would have no power over me unless it was granted from above." And I guess, I just think about that too, with Pilate not finding any guilt, trying to let him go. When Jesus says that to him, "You would have no power unless it was granted from above," and, because when they said, Jesus claims to be the Son of God, that struck some fear into Pilate. It troubled him to have them say that, Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. And, even the Romans, they had their gods and they had the ones that they worshiped and all of that. So, Pilate, again, it says in verse 12, from then on, Pilate tried to release him. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor." If you release Jesus, he's standing up against the emperor. He's claiming to be king, and the only king we have is the emperor. And so if you release him, if you don't hand him over to be crucified, you're going to be in trouble with the big guy, the king, and not that, Pilate was the ruler of that area, but not, the complete ruler of the Roman government. That was Caesar. So, well, when Pilate heard that, he brought Jesus out and sat him on a judge's bench, and Pilate said to them, here is your king. And the crowd hollers, away with him, take him out and crucify him. They just, it's such a hard thing to read. I mean, this is the 5th time this year we've read it. I mean, 4 times in the Gospels, as we're reading it, and then we lived through it at Easter time. And it never gets easier to hear of this death of Jesus. And Pilate says to them, shall I crucify your king? And they say, we have no king but the emperor. And he handed Jesus over then to be crucified. John's Gospel, John writes in the next deal, he says they took Jesus and carrying the cross by himself. They went out to the place called the Skull, Golgotha. The other 3 Gospels all have Simon of Cyrene being impressed or conscripted, pulled out of the crowd to say, you got to carry this cross. But John, as he writes his gospel, doesn't want Jesus to show any weakness. And so, but there's still discussion as to, John writes he carried his cross by himself, and then there's a little footnote until they conscripted Simon of Cyrene to take it the rest of the way. But I mean, that's not written in the gospel. That's an aside. But John, as he writes his gospel, doesn't want Jesus to show any weakness. He carried his cross by himself, John wants us to believe. And, it really doesn't change anything, which one is true. But what is true is that Jesus died on the cross. We know that. And so there out there at Golgotha, they crucified him. And John tells us too, with 2 others, one on either side, with Jesus between them. And Pilate had the inscription, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. I mean, Pilate had it right. He did, really, didn't he? And but of course the religious leaders didn't like that. They said, no, say he claimed to be, or he said. Pilate said, I have written what I have written. So Pilate, this Roman official who's got nothing to do with Jewish belief or Jewish trust or any of that, he had it right. That Jesus is, the King of the Jews, that he is the Son of God, that he wasn't guilty of anything. And truly, I really truly think that, deep down, all of these religious leaders and everybody else that were stirring people up against him, I mean, it was just, caught up in the emotions of the crowd. And how many of them really believed, when they looked at Jesus, that he was just an imposter, that he was just some guy that was full of hot air or something. I mean, well, maybe a lot of them did. But we do know that some of the Pharisees, some of the religious leaders, and some of the people believed then that Jesus is the King of the Jews, the Messiah. And we, of course, believe that today. So we end today's reading in verse 22 with Pilate saying, what I have written, I have written. And as I said, Pilate wrote what is right. Jesus is the King of the Jews, the Messiah.